I do not believe that America is moving right or left. I think that it's caving into a deindustrialized-fueled theocracy. When we talk about moving right, moving towards, conservative, you know, free market principles, or we talk about moving left, we talk about, collective concepts of property. America is not moving in either direction at all. America is moving towards ignorance, and ignorance does not exist on the spectrum. Even if it's maybe a little bit more correlated with the right. I've been over this a lot of times. Okay, America has this Roman fetish of itself. It sees its founding as a new Roman republic. But the ignorance here is actually exceedingly idiosyncratic. This is just a lack of self-awareness. The Roman analogy is actually excellent, but you have to understand it first. And that is by realizing that the new Roman Empire was the British Empire. And that's an excellent analogy as well. So Rome maps to London. That's the key point here. And then, the whole British colonial empire, the way that it shaped the world, right? Let's be real here. Look what the British did. It's not just America or North America. Large swaths of Africa, India, the Middle East, and even to a lesser extent in the east of Asia. Australia. The British have, in a very real sense, the British have remade the world in its own image. It's not to say that, these other civilizations are not going to have an effect on the world as it moves forward. But I think it's fair to say that even the civilization in China is fundamentally British in a lot of ways, right? This is maybe a little bit of a long-winded argument, and I recognize that I'm going to need some kind of argument if I'm going to make a statement like that. Even though it's intuitively correct, I'm going to get pushback, right? Karl Marx spent a lot of time in England and built his theory mostly in England, right? And that's really, I guess, all you need to... I mean, yes, Chinese culture is Chinese culture. It's not, China was never colonized and everything else, but the basic social system that's there is an addendum of British civilization, like it is pretty much everywhere else in the world. Everywhere that you look that has a parliament is basically British. It was the British that, came up with this idea and spread it. And that's not even, I mean, everybody knows democracy is Greek, right? But democracy as we understand it, parliamentary democracy, it itself came from Rome sometime in the past, right? Sort of. It's partially German too, right? The Germans had this idea called a thing. And, but it's, that's the tension in British culture, right? Is the Germans and the Romans through a million different levels of abstraction, right? It's the tension in all of Europe, really, is the Germans versus the Romans. I'm spinning out here. The point I'm trying to make is just that, we look back now and we say, most of us realize. I mean, it's not entirely true, right? I mean, I'll argue that I'm a barbarian, right? I don't have any patience for your Roman religions or your Roman customs. I'm a fucking barbarian, I want to go out and hunt in the woods. No, not at all. But I think I'm certainly a heathen. or at least by the terms that they would define, I'm pretty fucking heathen, right? But like the system is still. I mean, I live in a Roman civilization, right? I'm maybe that's what I'm trying to articulate is that I'm a heathen in a Roman civilization, and I think most of us look around the world and we say, okay, well, most of what exists around us is in some abstraction Roman, despite they hit their peak 2,000 years ago. Not not quite. When did what it was four? Oh, when did Rome fall? I know Constantinople fell in 1453. I think it was 470. Yeah, I think that's right. Well, it'll take you 3 seconds to look it up. It'll take me 3 seconds to look it up. I think it was 470. That was the sack of Rome by the was it the Vandals or the it was 410. That's not right. I may have been thinking of 376. 476. That was because that was the last emperor, right? That's right. That's the year I was thinking of was 476. That's right. And he was a Goth. That's right. Okay. I got the first two numbers right. Anyways. 470, 476. Um, so not too. I mean, it hit its peak about 2,000 years ago. It collapsed about 1,500 years ago. Despite this, we still see, we're on a different continent, and we still see our way of life and our customs and our morals in some abstraction. We still see this as fundamentally Roman, even though it's not. It's more Jewish, really, unless we are. Okay, I could spit out forever. Okay, the point I'm trying to make is that I think that 1,500 years from now, the majority of the world will see itself as, or will recognize itself as fundamentally British. Right? I mean, the Romans must have realized that they were fundamentally Carthaginian or fundamentally uh, fundamentally Greek in certain points, for sure. I mean, I'm sure. Well, we know that they realize it at some levels, right? And I think that however history unfolds, whatever the future brings us, the comparison of the Roman Empire to the British Empire. I mean, you're not going to find exact parallels in history, right? But if there ever was a comparison in history, the British to the Romans is as good as one is ever going to be. And in that context, America doesn't even exist, right? America is nothing but a phase of British civilization. But if you realize that, then something that comes up very cleanly, very nicely in the analogy is that, I don't know, about 200 years ago or so, there was a partition in the empire, right? And I've made this argument before as well, is that in the long term, in the long view of history, nobody's going to look at this, conflict in the colonies, in the late 18th century. Nobody's going to see that as a revolution. People are going to see that as a civil war. And they're going to realize that today, the British are a puppet state within the American Empire, right? The American Empire did not partition so much as it became, right? And what is the American Empire? It is precisely the same thing as the British Empire. What's happened is that the nexus of power has moved from London to Washington. Much like in the Roman Empire, the center of power moved from Rome to Constantinople. And after Rome had fallen, Constantinople carried on for 1,000 years. Might America carry on much longer? Perhaps. But it's also true that in the course of that 1,000 years, there was nothing but decline. And I find this interesting because you can find the right emperor. And I talked about this a little bit before. Donald Trump is a Justinian. Now, Justinian has a complicated place in Byzantine history. Some see him as kind of a... Well, he was certainly seen as a strong man, right? And they kind of want to take a side, which is probably the same thing as how it's happening right now, right? So you'll find historians that want to take Justinian's side in his quest to make the empire great again. And they'll make up excuses for, this terrible thing he did or that terrible thing he did because he's trying to make the empire great again, right? I think that objective historians see him as pretty much as a failed despot. And what ended up happening at the end is that Justinian ran out of money. He conquered lots of space, and he had no money at the end of it. He left the empire bigger than when he got there, but he left the defenses poor. He left the coffers empty, right? So the empire that Justinian inherited was small and prosperous. Okay? And the empire that Justinian left was large and poor. And it wasn't very long after Justinian died that the whole thing started to unravel. Because he stretched it too far and he bankrupted it. But I'm trying to talk about the analogy here. America is the new Byzantine Empire. Not the new Roman Empire, but the new Byzantine Empire, which is the Roman Empire. But it's the new Eastern Partition, being the Western Partition. Washington is not the new Rome, but the new Rome. Washington is the new Constantinople. And this collapse into theocracy is exactly what happened there. In the end days of the Byzantine Empire, there was a brutal collapse into theocracy as their enemies closed in on all sides. But it was before that too. There's this large period in Byzantine history where you had these two groups. You had the people that wanted icons and the people that rejected icons. And every time one of them took over, they would erase the history of the other one. So there's this period in Byzantine history. It's like 300 years or something. Like it's a long period. And this isn't ancient history either, right? It's like 1,000 years ago. But there's this... It's the Middle Ages, right? So, I mean, like, it's before... What else was happening around at this period? Well, I mean, it's the same period that when the Arabs were at their peak, right? So, I mean, this isn't old. It's old, but it's not old, right? It's certainly, the Rome itself had fallen for 500 years. Like, this isn't a period where we should have difficulty reconstructing sources. That's what I'm trying to get at. This is very firmly in the historical period. And yet, in what, was once, anyways, the center of civilization, we have bad sources. They're poorly written. They're rewritten. They're written over top of each other. We can tell that this was erased, and If you can imagine, like scrawling out the historical records and like writing things in the margin, or like erasing it, and or like gluing a post-it note on top of it, like stuff like that, right? Just like shoddily rewritten records, so that it's the point where we know this was rewritten, and we know this was rewritten over and over again, but we have no idea what it actually said in the first place. Because you had these groups of people, like I say, some of them wanted icons on display, and if you know anything about the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, they kind of Western Christians would probably like certainly Protestants would flip out if they ever saw this. But if you go to Russia or Greece, Armenia, the whole eastern side of Europe, and you see Christians worship, they will get down on their knees and they will do the whole arm waving bow thing to little pictures of Jesus, right? They're called icons, and they will worship the pictures of Jesus, which is there's a commandment about that or something somewhere, right? Which is what the iconoclasts. Every time I talk about this, I forget what the actual technical terms are. The iconoclasts wanted to destroy them, whereas the iconophiles wanted to worship them, and they fought back and forth, like I said, for hundreds of years. And every time the iconoclasts would take over power, they would erase the history of the iconophiles and then rewrite it. And then when the iconophiles took over history, they would erase the history of the iconoclasts and rewrite it from their perspective. And so history was written and erased and rewritten and erased and rewritten over and over and over again. And what we have today is this half-written diarrhea. It's a mess. That's what theocracy does, okay? Like I say, this is a several century-long period in the Middle Ages, deep into the historical period, where we have no meaningful historical records for what should be the center of civilization. That's how powerful theocracy is. Or how powerfully dangerous theocracy is. And you can imagine that the empire was not able to withstand this, right? I mean, everything else happening, you got the Russians coming down from the north, you got the Arabs coming up from the south, you got Turks coming in, and the Germans coming down from the other side, like people coming from all over the place, and they all want the empire, right? They all want the city. Like, you end up with the Western Christians fighting. Well, I mean, look what they're doing, right? With everything else, I mean, and then you throw this on top of it. Like I say, by the very end, it was such a backwards society. It had been broken so badly. Then the ignorance was so profound that it's actually understood that in the end, they let the city fall. The fortifications were truly impenetrable. They'd stood for 1,000 years. And the Turks really didn't have anything the Arabs hadn't for 1,000 years previous. The Arabs had battering rams too. Certainly had nothing that could match the Greek fire. The Romans let the city fall because they thought that the end of the empire was the end of the world. And you know what happens at the end of the world? Jesus comes back. The Roman Empire, the greatest empire, the empire of empires, fell because its inhabitants wanted Jesus to come back. That's how dangerous theocracy is. Not just the people, not just the merchants, but the aristocrats, the whole society was under the control of this virus. And of course the Turks just laughed. They parked their horses in the cathedrals. And from the manger, nary a sound.